The sky over Pearl Harbor was filled with a deafening roar as the Mitsubishi A6M Zero darted effortlessly through the air, cutting through the clouds like a knife through silk. It was 1941, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's Zero fighter was dominating the skies, striking fear into every Allied pilot who saw it. Its speed, agility, and range were unmatched. For a time, it seemed invincible, a perfect killing machine. But behind the legend of the Zero lay a different story. A story of engineering genius combined with a critical oversight, one that would ultimately become its undoing. In the early days of World War II, the Zero was a revelation. Developed by Mitsubishi and first introduced in 1939, this lightweight fighter was designed with one goal in mind: superiority in aerial combat. And for a brief moment, it was unstoppable. Its sleek, compact design, coupled with a highly efficient engine, allowed it to outmaneuver virtually any enemy aircraft in the Pacific. At Pearl Harbor, it was the Zero that led the charge, decimating the American Pacific Fleet in one of the most devastating surprise attacks in military history. Its success was undeniable, and for many, it represented the pinnacle of military aviation. But there was more to the Zero than just speed and agility. It was a plane that could fly longer distances than any other Allied fighter at the time. Its ability to engage enemy bombers and fighters over long distances was unmatched. It could reach enemy targets quickly, take down bombers with ease, and then return to base with fuel to spare. To Allied pilots, it was a nightmare that they couldn't outrun. For months, the Zero remained undefeated in aerial combat. Allied pilots, including the famed P-40 Warhawk pilots, learned to avoid dogfights with the Zero, knowing that it could outmaneuver them at every turn. Even the best pilots in the world were left helpless in the face of the Zero's mastery of the skies. But then, something unexpected happened. As the war dragged on, Allied pilots began to realize that they were not fighting a perfect machine. They started to notice the Zero's limitations. They began to understand that its strengths, its agility, and range came with a price. And it was a price that would soon cost the Zero its place in the skies. Would you have believed the Zero was unbeatable when you first heard of it, or would you have spotted its weaknesses early on? Share your thoughts in the comments below. When the Zero first appeared on the scene, its incredible speed and maneuverability gave it an aura of invincibility. But there was a darker side to its design, one that would soon become its most fatal flaw: its highly flammable construction. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was designed to be a lightweight, nimble fighter. To achieve this, its engineers used materials that were ideal for speed and agility, but not for durability. The aircraft's body was primarily constructed from light alloys and fabric, materials that made it quicker and more responsive than the heavier, more cumbersome Allied fighters. But those same materials also made the Zero more vulnerable to enemy fire. The Zero's wings, for instance, were made of a thin aluminum alloy, which offered little resistance to bullets or shrapnel. The fuel tanks were positioned in critical areas, including near the fuselage and wings, making them easy targets in a dogfight. In the heat of battle, the smallest hit to these tanks often turned the Zero into a fiery inferno. Unlike American fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which used self-sealing fuel tanks that could prevent fires after a hit, the Zero had no such protections. This meant that once a bullet pierced its thin skin and ruptured the fuel tanks, the aircraft was often doomed. The flames would spread quickly, engulfing the plane in seconds, leaving the pilot with little chance to survive. Allied pilots quickly learned to exploit this weakness. They began aiming for the Zero's wings and fuel tanks, knowing that a well-placed shot would send the aircraft into a blaze. The result was terrifying for the Japanese pilots who flew the Zero. Once their plane was hit, there was little they could do to control the flames, and if the fire reached the cockpit, survival was almost impossible. A chilling example of this flaw came from a combat veteran who survived a direct hit while flying a Zero. He described the moment the bullet hit his plane, followed by the unmistakable roar of fire as the aircraft erupted in flames. In an instant, he knew his only option was to bail out, but it was too late. The fire spread too quickly, and by the time he reached the ground, the Zero was nothing but a smoldering wreck. But this deadly flaw wasn't immediately apparent to all who flew it. Many Japanese pilots were unaware of the vulnerability of their aircraft until they saw their fellow pilots go down in flames. For a time, the myth of the Zero's invincibility persisted. It wasn't until the tide of war began to turn, particularly after the devastating loss at Midway, that the true cost of the Zero's construction became apparent. With Allied fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and P-38 Lightning learning to exploit this weakness, the once feared Zero was suddenly no longer the menace it once had been. True or false? Was the Zero's lack of self-sealing fuel tanks the sole reason it became less effective as the war went on? What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The thrill of flying the Zero was unparalleled, at least. That's what the Japanese pilots would tell you. For them, the Mitsubishi A6M was not just a plane, it was an extension of their own will. The Zero was responsive, agile, and a joy to fly in a dogfight. But there was a dark side to this beauty, one that few pilots truly understood until it was too late. Once the Zero was hit, it was often a death sentence. To the pilots who flew it, the Zero represented the peak of technological achievement. It was a machine designed for one purpose, to dominate the skies. And in the early years of the war, it did just that. Its unmatched agility allowed Japanese pilots to perform daring maneuvers, outwitting and outlasting the more cumbersome Allied planes. One veteran Japanese pilot, who had flown the Zero in the attack on Pearl Harbor, described it as a fighter like no other. He spoke of how easily the Zero could roll and dive, its small frame cutting through the air with precision. In his eyes, the Zero was a tool for victory, and its design gave him the confidence to fly straight into the heart of enemy formations. However, that confidence came at a price. Despite the Zero's incredible speed and agility, it had no real armor protection for the pilot. The cockpit was light, with little shielding from the barrage of bullets and shrapnel that filled the sky during battle. The aircraft's thin construction, which allowed it to be so nimble, also made it highly susceptible to damage, and the moment that damage ignited the fuel tanks, the fate of the pilot was sealed. In a dogfight, the slightest hit could turn the Zero into a flying torch. It was a nightmare for pilots who knew that one bullet could be the last. The feeling of hearing the familiar thud of enemy fire, followed by the rising heat of a fire in the wings, was one of the most terrifying experiences a Zero pilot could endure. One pilot, who survived several dogfights in the Pacific, recalled the moment he first realized the deadly flaw of his aircraft. After taking a hit from an enemy, .50 caliber bullet, he felt the unmistakable warmth of flames licking at his legs. In that instant, the Zero stopped being a machine he controlled and instead became a vessel of death. The pilot fought the controls, desperate to regain control, but the flames spread quickly. The aircraft was already lost. Another pilot, a veteran of the Battle of Midway, spoke of how he watched a fellow Zero pilot go down in flames after a lucky shot from an American Wildcat. The aircraft spun out of control, trailing smoke and fire, and the pilot's face was barely visible through the cockpit glass. It was an all-too-common sight by the middle of the war, Japanese pilots being consumed by the very plane they had once trusted so completely. But what was perhaps most chilling was the realization that many Zero pilots had no idea just how vulnerable they were. It wasn't until the war dragged on and the Allies developed more advanced tactics that Japanese pilots began to understand the true risk of flying the Zero. It was too late. By then the tide of war had already shifted, and the Zero's former superiority was a distant memory. But what happened next shocked even the pilots themselves. As the Allies began to refine their tactics, the Zero's once feared advantages quickly began to erode. With each encounter, the Allies learned more and more about how to exploit its vulnerabilities. The Japanese pilots, once so confident, found themselves facing an enemy that was no longer afraid to fight back. Would you have felt the same confidence flying the Zero, knowing that even the slightest hit could send your plane and your life up in flames? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As the war raged on, the Zero's reputation as a fearsome predator began to crumble. Once an unstoppable force in the Pacific skies, it now faced an enemy that had learned to exploit its fatal flaw, a flaw that would lead to its downfall. The turning point came during the Battle of Midway in 1942, a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. Until then, the Zero had been the undisputed king of the skies, its unmatched agility allowing Japanese pilots to strike with precision. But in the intense aerial combat at Midway, the Zero was forced to face an opponent that had learned how to fight back. Allied pilots, particularly those flying the F-4F Wildcat, began to target the Zero's most vulnerable points. They aimed for the wings, the fuel tanks, and the fuselage, the very areas that made the Zero so fast, but also so flammable. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese. One of the first Allied strategies to exploit the Zero's weakness was simple: fire at the wings. The thin aluminum construction of the Zero's wings couldn't withstand sustained fire from larger caliber rounds. Once pierced, the fuel tanks would rupture and the aircraft would ignite. Allied pilots quickly learned that a well-placed shot to the Zero's wing could turn the plane into a fiery ball, often before the pilot had time to react. At Midway, U.S. Navy pilots, now fully aware of the Zero's vulnerabilities, took full advantage. As the Zero dove in for another attack, U.S. pilots would wait for the right moment, a brief opening to fire at the plane's wings or its exposed fuel tanks. In seconds, the Zero would be engulfed in flames, spiraling out of control, unable to recover. The turning tide at Midway was not only a blow to the Japanese fleet, but also a symbolic victory in the air. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was now no longer feared. The Allies had discovered the secret that had been hidden for so long, and they used it to their advantage. But Midway was just the beginning. As the war progressed, the Allies developed new tactics and new aircraft that further exposed the Zero's vulnerabilities. The P-38 Lightning, with its heavy armament, was particularly effective at bringing down Zeros. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its robust design and powerful guns, could take out a Zero with a single burst of fire. Even the F-4U Corsair, with its larger frame and heavier firepower, proved to be a formidable threat to the Japanese fighter. Allied pilots became increasingly adept at taking out Zeros. The use of higher caliber ammunition, longer-range guns, and tactical positioning meant that the Zero could no longer rely on its once invincible agility. It was now a target, and no longer the predator. But the question remained: why did it take so long for the Allies to exploit the Zero's weakness? The answer lies in the fact that in the early stages of the war, the Zero was simply too good. Its speed and maneuverability were so overwhelming that the Allies initially struggled to keep up. But as they learned from each engagement, they developed strategies that neutralized the Zero's advantages. True or false? Would the Zero have been more effective if the Allies had adapted their tactics earlier? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Zero's early dominance in the skies made it seem invincible. For over a year, it was the undisputed king of the Pacific, feared by every Allied pilot who encountered it. But what took the Allies so long to exploit its deadly flaw? How did it take so much time for them to realize that the Zero, while fast and agile, was incredibly vulnerable? The answer lies in the psychology of combat and the inherent challenges of facing an enemy fighter that seemed untouchable. At the outset of the war, the Zero was a revelation. Allied pilots had never encountered a fighter like it before. Its speed and maneuverability were unlike anything they had faced. In fact, many pilots were so focused on avoiding the Zero's deadly dogfights that they didn't have the time to analyze its weaknesses. They were too busy staying alive. When the Zero first appeared at Pearl Harbor, it took the Allies by surprise. The attack was swift and devastating, and the Japanese pilots, flying their new aircraft, were able to outmaneuver and overwhelm the American defenses. The Zero's dominance was solidified by its remarkable performance in subsequent battles, such as the Battle of the Coral Sea and the early phases of Midway. For months, the Allies were caught off guard. The Zero's lightweight construction, combined with its agility, meant that Allied fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and the F-4F Wildcat struggled to keep up. The Allies' tactics were often focused on avoiding dogfights with the Zero, rather than countering its vulnerabilities. It wasn't until the Battle of Midway that the Allies began to understand how to exploit the Zero's flaws. The turning point came when U.S. Navy pilots, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, discovered that the Zero's agility was its strength, but also its weakness. By learning how to position themselves strategically, they could fire at the Zero's most vulnerable spots, particularly its wings and fuel tanks. This realization came after numerous failed engagements, but the battle-tested pilots had finally figured it out. What was surprising to many, though, was how long it took for this strategy to develop. In part, the Zero's initial success had created a psychological barrier. Pilots on both sides were locked in a brutal dogfight, focused on survival rather than exploitation of weaknesses. Even when the Allies began to understand the Zero's vulnerabilities, they were often reluctant to change tactics too drastically. They needed to feel confident that the new approach would work before fully committing to it. Another factor was the development of new aircraft and weaponry that could take advantage of the Zero's flaws. In the early stages of the war, the Allies lacked the firepower to deal with the Zero's agility, but as new fighter planes like the P-51 Mustang and the F-6F Hellcat came into play, the Allies had the tools they needed to challenge the Zero head-on. The presence of these new aircraft allowed Allied pilots to approach combat differently. No longer would they be limited by the Zero's superior agility. With heavier, faster, and more powerful planes at their disposal, they could now target the Zero's vulnerabilities with precision. The human drama of the war is exemplified in the experiences of the pilots who faced the Zero day in and day out. Some pilots learn to recognize the Zero's weaknesses only after watching fellow comrades perish in fiery crashes. Others, like Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Skeeter Keogh, who flew the F-6F Hellcat, became intimately familiar with the strategy of exploiting the Zero's lack of armor. Keogh himself recounted the day when he saw a Zero pilot engulfed in flames after a direct hit to the fuel tank. He remembered the sickening feeling of watching a fellow aviator die, a stark reminder of the brutal nature of aerial combat. The slow exposure of the Zero's flaws is a testament to how difficult it was for the Allies to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. It was not just about flying a better plane, but also about adjusting tactics, learning from mistakes, and building the confidence to take the fight to the enemy. True or false? The Zero's superiority in the early stages of the war made it harder for the Allies to adapt quickly. Do you think it took too long to expose its weaknesses? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Despite its vulnerabilities, The Mitsubishi A6M Zero left an indelible mark on the history of aviation. The aircraft's legacy is not just defined by its early successes and later decline, but by the lessons it taught both the Allies and the world of aerial combat. By the time the Zero's flaws were fully exposed, the war had already shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies. The once dominant aircraft was now a relic of a different era, a symbol of the early days of the Pacific War, before the tide turned at Midway. But even as it faded from the skies, the Zero had an undeniable influence on aviation development. In the years following the war, many of the lessons learned from the Zero's design would be applied to the next generation of fighters. Its agility and speed had made it a formidable opponent, but it also revealed how crucial it was to balance maneuverability with survivability. The Zero's inability to protect its pilot or withstand sustained damage highlighted the importance of armored cockpits and self-sealing fuel tanks in future aircraft designs. The US and Allied forces would use these lessons to build more durable, more survivable fighters like the F-4U Corsair and the P-51 Mustang. These planes combined the agility of the Zero with the armor and firepower needed to endure battle. While the Zero had ruled the skies with an unmatched grace, its demise led to an evolution in fighter design that would shape the course of air combat for decades to come. In the post-war years, aviation engineers often pointed to the Zero's flaws as an example of what to avoid. The Zero's lightweight construction, which had once given it such an advantage in speed and agility, now served as a cautionary tale. It taught designers that, while speed and maneuverability were crucial, they were nothing without the ability to survive long enough to use them. The Zero's influence can also be seen in the legacy of the pilots who flew it. While the aircraft may have had its flaws, the skill and bravery of its pilots were undeniable. Even as the Zero's weaknesses became more apparent, the pilots who flew it continued to fight fiercely for their country. Some of the most legendary pilots in aviation history, like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, flew the Zero, and their skill in the cockpit continues to be respected today. The tragic irony of the Zero's fatal flaw lies in the fact that, for all its power, it was ultimately its very nature, its lightweight build, its speed, and its maneuverability that led to its demise. It was an aircraft built to win quickly, but it couldn't sustain the rigors of prolonged combat. And in the end, that lack of durability proved to be the Zero's undoing. Despite its fall from grace, the Zero's legacy endures. Its role in the early years of World War II, its impact on Japanese naval aviation, and the lessons it imparted on aircraft design remains significant in the history of aerial warfare. It may have been a flying torch in battle, but it was also a symbol of the ambition and ingenuity of the Japanese military during the war. So, what do you think? Was the Zero's fatal flaw a product of its time, or was it a design oversight that doomed the aircraft from the beginning? Let us know in the comments below. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero is remembered as one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II. It struck terror into the hearts of Allied pilots in the early days of the Pacific War, its agility and speed unmatched by anything the Allies could field. The Zero's initial successes and dominance in the skies made it the symbol of Japan's military power. But, like many great legends, the Zero's story is one of contradictions, a mixture of brilliance and fatal flaws. The fatal flaw that ultimately led to the Zero's demise was its highly flammable construction. Its lightweight design, though perfect for speed and maneuverability, left it vulnerable to the smallest of hits. The result was catastrophic for the pilots flying it. What was once seen as a nearly invincible aircraft became a dangerous liability in combat. The same qualities that made the Zero an early success also made it a flying torch, prone to bursting into flames once it was hit. But despite this fatal flaw, the Zero's legacy lives on. It was a masterpiece of aviation design that revolutionized air combat for a time, showing the world what a fighter could be. It taught the Allies critical lessons about aircraft durability and vulnerability, lessons that would shape fighter designs for generations to come. The Zero was not simply a weapon of war. It was also a symbol of the courage and sacrifice of the pilots who flew it. Even as the aircraft became less effective, its pilots continued to fight bravely for their country, embodying the spirit of the aircraft they trusted so completely. The Zero was not just a plane, it was a testament to their commitment, their sacrifice, and their hope for victory, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Was the Zero the best fighter of World War II, or was it simply the best timed? Was its downfall inevitable, or could it have been saved with better design choices? In the end, the story of the Zero is a reminder that no machine, no matter how fast, agile, or powerful, is invincible. Every strength has its corresponding weakness, and sometimes the smallest flaw can have the biggest consequences. So, what do you think? Was the Zero's fatal flaw its ultimate downfall, or did it seal its own fate from the start? Share your thoughts below, and let's continue the conversation.